You are a disgrace to this family, Duchess.
How could you say such a thing?
Everyone here knows the truth. Don't pretend otherwise.
The Ashbourne Victory Ball had become one of the most anticipated evenings of the year. Every winter, the grand halls of Ashbourne Manor welcomed military officers, members of Parliament, neighbouring nobles, and families whose names had shaped England for generations. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in warm golden light, while an orchestra played elegant waltzes beneath towering evergreen trees decorated with white candles and silver ribbons. To every guest who crossed the marble floor, the evening represented honour, celebration, and the proud memory of sacrifices made during the war. To Duchess Eleanor Ashbourne, however, it felt strangely lonely. She smiled politely as she greeted each guest beside her husband. Yet she could not ignore the quiet glances that lingered a little too long or the conversations that stopped the moment she approached. 3 years had passed since her marriage to Duke William Ashbourne. But to many members of high society, she remained an outsider, a woman whose gentle manners and modest upbringing could never quite erase the fact that she had not been born into nobility. William noticed those looks. He always did. More than once, he reached for Eleanor's hand beneath the folds of her evening gown, giving it the smallest reassuring squeeze before returning his attention to their guests. It was a habit she had come to cherish, a silent reminder that even when the room questioned her place beside him, her husband never had. At least, that was what she believed. Across the ballroom, William's younger brother, Lord Charles Ashbourne, accepted another glass of champagne from a passing servant. Handsome, charming, and effortlessly confident, Charles possessed the rare ability to fill every room with laughter. Unfortunately, much of that laughter came at someone else's expense. His eyes settled on Eleanor. A slow smile appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with playful confidence, "I was just telling Sir Richard how remarkable my brother's marriage truly is." Several nearby guests turned toward him with polite curiosity. Charles raised his glass. Most duchesses spend their childhood learning how to host royal banquets. He glanced toward Eleanor. Our dear Eleanor had to learn rather quickly. A ripple of restrained laughter passed through the crowd. Eleanor lowered her eyes for only a moment before lifting them again with quiet composure. She had heard worse. William heard it too. He looked toward Charles, already considering whether to intervene, but before he could speak, the Dowager Duchess lightly touched his arm. "Leave it," she murmured without looking away from the guests. "Your brother is entertaining people. Don't turn harmless teasing into family drama." William hesitated. Charles had always enjoyed provoking reactions. Challenging him publicly often encouraged him to continue rather than stop. Perhaps, William thought, silence really would end the matter more quickly. So he said nothing. Charles mistook that silence for permission. He wandered closer, smiling as though he were telling an amusing story among friends. "Eleanor," he asked pleasantly, "tell us something." She met his eyes. "What would you like to know? What was your family's estate called before you became Duchess?" The question sounded innocent. It was not. Several guests immediately understood the trap. Eleanor's father had never owned an estate. Her family had lived comfortably but modestly in a country village. She answered honestly, "We never had one." Charles nodded sympathetically. He took another sip before continuing. "I imagine Ashbourne Hall must have been quite overwhelming during your first visit." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. William felt his jaw tighten. He glanced toward Eleanor, hoping she would simply excuse herself before Charles found another excuse to continue. Instead, she remained where she was. Gracefully, calmly. She refused to let humiliation chase her from her own home. Charles walked slowly around the ballroom until he stopped beside a display cabinet where William's military decorations rested beneath polished glass. He opened the cabinet without asking. Among the medals lay the Cross of Black Hollow, the decoration awarded to William after the battle that had made him one of England's most celebrated war heroes. Charles lifted the medal carefully. "Everyone in this room admires courage." He turned toward Eleanor. "My brother earned this because he was willing to sacrifice everything." The ballroom became unusually quiet. Then Charles smiled again. "What exactly have you ever sacrificed?" No one laughed this time. The question lingered in the air with astonishing cruelty. William felt every pair of eyes shift between his brother and his wife. He should speak. His mother remained perfectly composed beside him. "Not here," she whispered. "You'll only create a scandal." William convinced himself she was right. The evening would end soon. Charles would eventually grow bored. It would pass. He never noticed Eleanor looking toward him. Not pleading. Not angry. Simply waiting. Waiting for the man who had once promised she would never face the world alone. When she finally understood that he would not speak, something inside her quietly changed. She turned back toward Charles. Her voice remained soft enough that the guests leaned forward to hear. Sometimes the deepest sacrifice isn't seen by anyone. Charles raised an eyebrow. And what sacrifice would that be? She held William's gaze as she answered. Choosing silence even when it breaks your own heart. No one moved. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. Without another word, Eleanor gently removed the wedding ring from her finger. She did not throw it. She did not place it dramatically on the floor. Instead, she walked to the grand piano near the ballroom entrance and laid the ring upon its polished surface with extraordinary care. The tiny sound of gold touching wood echoed through the room far louder than anyone expected. Then she inclined her head politely toward the assembled guests. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the evening. She left the ballroom with quiet dignity, her footsteps disappearing into the long corridor beyond the double doors. No one followed her. For several seconds, even Charles seemed unsure whether he had gone too far. William remained frozen where he stood. His eyes never left the ring resting alone beneath the chandelier's golden light. The celebration continued around him, but the music no longer sounded joyful. The conversations became distant. The applause meant nothing. Slowly, almost mechanically, he crossed the ballroom and picked up Eleanor's wedding ring. It still held the warmth of her hand. Only then did he realize that the woman walking away had taken something far more precious than gold with her. For the first time since the war, Duke William Ashbourne felt what it was like to lose without hearing a single gunshot. The victory ball ended hours before sunrise, yet Ashbourne Hall remained awake long after the last carriage disappeared beyond the front gates. Servants quietly extinguished candles, gathered abandoned champagne glasses, and removed the elaborate floral arrangements that had decorated the ballroom only hours earlier. The house looked exactly as it had every winter after the annual celebration. But an uneasy silence lingered in every corridor as though the manor itself understood that something far more valuable than an evening's festivities had come to an end. He had picked it up instinctively after she walked away, but now he found himself unable to decide what to do with it. It seemed impossibly small for something that suddenly carried so much weight. More than once, he reached toward it, only to stop before his fingers touched the gold again. He had survived battlefields where men shouted through smoke and cannon fire. Yet the memory that refused to leave him was Eleanor's silence as she laid the ring upon the piano. That realization unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. The following morning, William crossed the manor to the guest wing where Eleanor had moved after leaving the ballroom. He paused outside the door longer than he expected, listening to the faint crackle of a fireplace from inside. Finally, he knocked. "Come in." Her voice sounded calm. When he entered, he found Eleanor sitting beside the window with a book resting on her lap. Morning light spilled across the room, softening her features, yet it could not hide the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. She looked as though she had not slept, though she had taken great care not to let that weariness become visible to anyone else. William closed the door behind him. "I came to apologize." Eleanor looked at him for several moments before gently closing the book. He took a slow breath. "I should have stopped Charles. Yes. I thought ignoring him would end it." She offered the smallest nod. "I believe you." Those words should have comforted him. Instead, they made him feel worse. He stepped closer, struggling to find the explanation that had seemed so reasonable only hours earlier. "I didn't want the evening to become a public argument." Eleanor's expression remained gentle. It already was. The room fell silent. William lowered his eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you. I know." Again, she answered without anger, without accusation, without raising her voice. Then she looked directly at him. "But it wasn't your brother who humiliated me." William's heart tightened. "It was your silence." The words were spoken almost as a whisper, yet they carried more weight than if she had shouted them before the entire ballroom. "When Charles questioned my worth," she continued quietly, "I wasn't waiting for him to change." Her gaze never left his. "I was waiting for you." William felt something inside him collapse. For years, he had believed love was measured by loyalty, provision, and protection from danger. He had never imagined that failing to speak at the right moment could wound someone more deeply than any cruel insult. "I don't know how to undo last night," he admitted. Eleanor's eyes softened. You can't. She rose from her chair and walked toward the fireplace. You can only decide whether it becomes the beginning of something better or the memory that follows us for the rest of our lives. William wanted to say more. Instead, he quietly placed the wedding ring upon the small table beside her. I'll keep hoping you'll wear it again. She looked at the ring but made no effort to pick it up. I hope so too. It was not forgiveness. But it was not goodbye. Over the following days, William found himself noticing details about Eleanor that he had somehow overlooked throughout their marriage. One afternoon, he entered the library searching for an estate ledger. And found her studying a collection of military maps spread neatly across the reading table. She traced several faded supply routes with remarkable confidence before carefully marking a narrow mountain pass with a pencil. William smiled. I didn't know you enjoyed military history. Eleanor looked up, seemingly surprised to find him there. I enjoy understanding people. He glanced toward the maps. Most people wouldn't recognize half these symbols. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Books can teach almost anything. William accepted the answer. Yet something about it lingered in his thoughts long after he left the library. 2 days later, he passed the manor's infirmary and noticed Eleanor speaking with an elderly gardener whose injured hand had become badly infected. Rather than simply comforting the old man, she calmly instructed the physician to clean the wound differently before wrapping it with fresh linen. The doctor paused. Then followed her suggestion without argument. When William later asked why, the physician smiled. Her Grace understands battlefield infections remarkably well. Battlefield. The word caught William's attention. That evening, he remembered something else. Whenever fireworks celebrated the king's birthday, Eleanor quietly disappeared before the first explosion echoed across the estate. Whenever veterans spoke about particular campaigns, she listened with unusual stillness, never asking questions, never interrupting. Yet somehow seeming to know exactly what they meant before they finished speaking. None of it made sense. Not individually. But together, the pieces formed a picture he had never bothered to see. The answer arrived unexpectedly several days later. Ashbourne Hall hosted a small luncheon for retired officers, raising funds for wounded veterans. Among the guests was General Edmund Hale, one of the most respected commanders of the war and a man William had admired since childhood. After the meal, Eleanor quietly excused herself to oversee the charitable donations prepared for the veterans' families. As she crossed the entrance hall, General Hale happened to glance toward her. His conversation stopped in the middle of a sentence. He stared after her, not with admiration, but with recognition. A strange expression crossed his weathered face as though he had suddenly remembered something buried many years ago. Without another word, he excused himself and slowly followed her into the corridor. William noticed. Curiosity overcame him. A few moments later, he found the general standing several yards away while Eleanor adjusted one of the donation crates. Neither of them spoke. General Hale's eyes rested briefly on the faint scar that disappeared beneath the neckline of Eleanor's dress before he looked away again. His voice became almost inaudible. So, you kept your promise? Eleanor smiled sadly. I had to. The general lowered his head with unmistakable respect. I always wondered whether he'd ever learn the truth. She gently shook her head. He doesn't need to. Before William could step forward or ask what either of them meant, Eleanor quietly walked away, leaving the general standing alone in the corridor. William approached him immediately. What truth? General Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. Some debts are carried in silence, Your Grace. William frowned. What does that mean? The old soldier simply placed a weathered hand upon William's shoulder. If you truly wish to know, you'll have to stop looking at your wife as the Duchess of Ashbourne. He paused before adding softly, and begin wondering who she was long before she ever became Eleanor Ashbourne. William had faced enemy fire without hesitation, yet nothing had ever unsettled him as deeply as the general's final words. Begin wondering who she was long before she ever became Eleanor Ashbourne. Those words followed him through every room of the manor. They lingered during estate meetings, interrupted his concentration while reviewing correspondence, and echoed in his mind each night when sleep refused to come. He had spent 3 years believing he knew every important chapter of his wife's life, only to discover there were entire pages he had never thought to read. 2 mornings later, William rode to the Royal Military Archives in London. The Records building stood behind heavy stone walls, not far from the old War Office, where thousands of documents from the campaign were preserved. Most visitors searched for medals, promotions, or family histories. William searched for something far more uncertain. A name. A memory. A truth he could not yet define. An elderly archivist greeted him politely before leading him toward shelves filled with leather-bound campaign journals. What battle interests your grace? Black Hollow. The archivist nodded. One of the bloodiest. Several volumes were placed before him. William spent hours turning faded pages covered with troop movements, casualty reports, supply lists, and medical records. The more he read, the more one detail continued to appear: his rescue. Every official account agreed that Duke William Ashbourne had survived, because an unidentified soldier had carried him beyond enemy lines after the main retreat. Yet none of the reports contained a name, only the same brief description: unknown volunteer. No regiment, no rank, no identity. William frowned. Surely someone knew who. The archivist adjusted his spectacles. If they did, it was never recorded. That afternoon, William rode directly to General Edmund Hale's country estate. The old commander received him warmly, though his expression suggested he had expected this visit. I wondered how long it would take. William remained standing. You knew I would come. I knew you wouldn't stop asking questions. The general invited him into a quiet study lined with maps, military portraits, and shelves crowded with journals collected over 4 decades of service. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, filling the room with comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the unease William carried inside. He wasted no time. Who saved me? General Hale looked into the flames before answering. For years you believed it was a young infantryman. Yes. And if I told you there never was one? William stared at him. I don't understand. The general slowly opened an old wooden chest resting beside his desk. Inside lay weathered journals, faded photographs, and several military reports tied together with worn ribbon. He selected a thin leather notebook. This belonged to the field surgeon assigned to Black Hollow. William accepted it carefully. Several pages described the desperate retreat after enemy artillery had shattered the British line. One passage had been marked decades earlier: Lieutenant Ashbourne remains behind. Impossible to recover. One volunteer refuses evacuation despite direct orders. William continued reading. Volunteer departed wearing an infantry coat too large for the body beneath it. Face hidden beneath helmet and scarf. Returned shortly before dawn carrying the unconscious lieutenant. His pulse quickened. What happened afterward? The general answered quietly. The volunteer disappeared before sunrise. Who was it? General Hale met his eyes. I promised never to tell you. William stepped closer. Then why tell me now? Because your wife has spent 3 years paying the price for a promise she never should have carried alone. The room became silent. General Hale rose slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. When the war reached Black Hollow, our medical tents had already been destroyed. William listened without interrupting. She spent 3 days treating wounded soldiers without sleep. When word reached us that you had been left behind, every officer agreed there was no possibility of bringing you back alive. But someone tried. Yes. The general's voice softened. Not because she received an order. Because she refused to leave another human being to die. William felt his breathing become shallow. General Hale turned toward him. She cut her hair beneath a soldier's helmet. She borrowed an infantry uniform. She concealed her face beneath mud and blood. No one questioned another exhausted young soldier running toward the battlefield. William stood perfectly still. His mind struggled to connect the image before him with the quiet woman, who spent her mornings tending the manor gardens and reading beside the library window. The general continued, she found you unconscious beneath the remains of a collapsed bridge. Enemy patrols were already searching the area. She dragged you for nearly 2 miles before lifting you onto her back. William lowered his head. He could almost see it. Snow. Darkness. Gunfire. A lone figure refusing to surrender. Halfway across the valley, the general said quietly, a rifle round struck her shoulder. William looked up sharply. She never stopped. Another long silence followed. She carried you until she collapsed inside our field hospital, William whispered. Eleanor. General Hale nodded. She lost so much blood that the surgeons believed she would die before morning. William's hands tightened around the old journal. And after she recovered, I offered to recommend her for the King's Medal. What did she say? The old soldier smiled sadly. She asked me for only one thing. What? She made me promise that you would never learn her name. William could scarcely believe what he was hearing. Why? General Hale reached into the wooden chest once more. This time he removed a small leather pouch. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch. My father's watch. You lost it that night. General Hale handed it to him. She kept it because she hoped one day she could return it. William ran his thumb across the damaged metal. Memories long buried suddenly returned in broken fragments. A faint voice telling him to stay awake. Arms struggling beneath his weight. Snow falling across a dark valley. He had always believed those memories belonged to a young soldier. He had never imagined they belonged to Eleanor. Tears blurred his vision. I spent years searching for the man who saved me, the general answered gently. There never was one. William lowered himself slowly into the nearest chair. Everything he believed about the greatest night of his life had been wrong. Not only had he failed to recognize the woman who had saved him, he had allowed her to stand alone while his own brother questioned her worth before the entire nobility of England. Can she ever forgive me? General Hale looked at him with the quiet wisdom of a man who had witnessed both war and peace. I cannot answer that. He paused. But I know Eleanor. She has never cared about medals. She has never cared about titles. What she has always cared about, the general's voice became almost a whisper, is whether the man she risked everything to save would become worthy of the life she gave back to him. William looked down at the scarred pocket watch resting in his hands. For the first time since Black Hollow, he understood that surviving the war had not been the greatest gift Eleanor had given him. She had given him a second chance to become a better man. The question now was whether he had already wasted it. William returned to Ashbourne Hall just before sunset. The journey from General Hale's estate had taken only a few hours, yet he felt as though he had crossed an entire lifetime. Snow still covered the gardens outside the manor, untouched except for the narrow paths cleared by the servants. The world looked exactly as it had the morning before, but nothing inside him remained the same. He found Eleanor in the conservatory. She was kneeling beside a row of winter roses, carefully trimming a damaged stem. The afternoon light filtered through the glass ceiling, surrounding her with a quiet warmth that made the moment almost painfully ordinary. For several seconds, William simply watched her. This was the woman who had carried him across a battlefield while bleeding from a gunshot wound. The woman who had asked for no recognition. The woman he had failed to defend when she needed him most. Eleanor. She looked up and smiled politely. You've returned. I have. There were countless things he wanted to say, but none of them seemed worthy of the truth he now carried. I know. Her hands became still. She searched his face for a long moment before quietly asking, Who told you? General Hale. A faint sadness crossed her expression. I asked him never to. He kept that promise for years. William stepped closer. Longer than anyone. She lowered her eyes. I never wanted you to feel indebted to me. I don't. His voice broke slightly. I feel ashamed. The words hung between them. I spent years searching for the soldier who saved my life. He smiled bitterly. All that time, she was eating breakfast across the table from me. Eleanor remained silent. William reached into his coat and placed the scarred silver pocket watch gently upon the stone bench beside her. I finally know why you always looked at this as though it belonged somewhere else. She picked it up carefully. I meant to return it many times. Why didn't you? Because every time I tried. She looked toward the snow beyond the glass. It no longer seemed important. William's heart tightened. The life you built mattered more than the life you saved. She nodded once. I wanted to be your wife, not your hero. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then William looked at her with quiet determination. I cannot undo what happened at the Victory Ball. No. I cannot erase my silence. No. But I can make certain that silence ends today. 3 days later, invitations were delivered across London. Many believed Ashbourne Hall was hosting another celebration. Some assumed the Duke intended to announce a charitable foundation for wounded veterans. Others expected a military ceremony honoring General Hale. No one guessed the real purpose. The ballroom filled once again with officers, nobles, members of Parliament, and nearly every guest who had attended the Victory Ball. Charles arrived wearing the same effortless confidence he had worn only days before. William regarded him calmly. Neither was I. The orchestra remained silent. Instead of music, General Hale stepped forward. A murmur spread through the ballroom. The elderly commander rarely appeared at social events. When he did, people listened. For a long moment, he simply looked around the ballroom. Many of the faces before him had witnessed Eleanor's humiliation. They had witnessed his silence as well. "I invited you here," William began, "because several nights ago my wife was publicly insulted beneath this very roof." The ballroom grew perfectly still. "I believed that remaining silent would preserve peace." He paused. "I have since learned that silence can become its own form of betrayal." Across the room, Eleanor stood quietly beside one of the tall windows. She had no idea what he intended to say. William continued, "For many years, you have called me a war hero." His hand rose to the first medal upon his chest. "You honored me. You celebrated me. You believed I earned every one of these decorations through courage." Slowly, he removed the medal. Then another. And another. The soft sound of polished metal resting upon the velvet-covered table echoed through the silent ballroom. Finally, only the cross of black hollow remained. William held it in his hand. "I accepted this medal believing I had survived because of an unknown soldier." He looked toward Eleanor. "I was wrong." General Hale stepped forward. His steady voice carried through every corner of the hall. "There never was an unknown soldier." Gasps spread among the guests. The general continued. "The person who carried Duke William Ashbourne across the battlefield at Black Hollow was the Duchess of Ashbourne." Shock swept through the room. Several retired officers exchanged astonished glances. Others stared at Eleanor in complete disbelief. Charles laughed softly. "That is a remarkable story. But surely stories require proof." Without replying, General Hale produced the wartime journal from his leather case. He opened it to the marked page before handing it to one of the senior military officials present. The official read silently. Then another officer examined the field surgeon's report. Finally, an elderly colonel spoke. "The handwriting is authentic. The medical records match." The volunteer suffered a gunshot wound to the left shoulder. Every eye turned toward Eleanor. She instinctively touched the place where the old scar rested beneath her gown. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth stood before them. Charles's confidence disappeared. His face slowly lost all color. William walked toward Eleanor. Every guest expected him to kneel. He did not. Instead, he stopped only a few steps away. Then, with the dignity of a man laying down his pride rather than performing for applause, he bowed his head deeply before her. It was the deepest bow anyone had ever seen the Duke of Ashbourne give. His voice was quiet. Yet every person in the ballroom heard every word. "I believed courage was found on battlefields." He looked into Eleanor's eyes. "You spent years teaching me that true courage is choosing kindness when no one is watching." His hand gently placed the cross of Black Hollow into hers. "This was never mine. It belonged to you from the beginning." No applause followed. The silence carried far more meaning. Then something unexpected happened. General Hale straightened his aging shoulders and offered Eleanor a formal military salute. One by one, the retired officers beside him did the same. Another joined them. Within moments, every veteran in the ballroom stood at attention, saluting the quiet woman who had never asked for recognition. Several younger officers followed. Soon the entire room had risen. Some bowed respectfully. Others simply stood in silence. The honor Eleanor had refused for years had finally found its way to her. Charles slowly approached. For the first time in anyone's memory, there was no arrogance in his expression. "I wronged you." Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "Yes, I cannot change what I said." "No." He lowered his head. "I am sorry." She regarded him quietly before answering. "I accept your apology." Charles looked relieved. But Eleanor gently added, "Forgiveness and trust are not the same." He nodded. "I understand." For the first time, he truly did. As the guests gradually departed, William and Eleanor walked alone through the now empty ballroom. He did not try to place it on her hand. Instead, he opened his palm. "I won't ask you to forget. I only ask for the chance to become the husband you deserved from the beginning." Eleanor looked at the ring for several quiet moments. Then she looked at William. "The man I married wasn't perfect. He never was." She smiled gently. "But neither was I." Carefully, she took the ring from his hand and slipped it back onto her finger. William let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She reached for his hand. Not because everything had been repaired, but because they had finally begun repairing it together. As they stepped out of the ballroom, fresh snow had begun to fall once again over Ashbourne Hall. This time, however, neither of them walked alone.